Namaskar and welcome to Doordarshan. Today we'll be having conversation with Professor Sir John Byrne. Professor John Byrne is a British scientist and have leading role in National Health Service of United Kingdom. He has a major role in pioneering research on using aspirin to prevent cancer in individuals with the Lynch syndrome. Today, we'll be talking with him on genetics, its future, and role of aspirin in cancer prevention. So, we welcome Dr. John Byrne on the show. Welcome, Dr. John Byrne.
Thank you, Najib.
Dr. John, we will start with very simple terminology. As a layman in India, how would you explain what is genetics? How do a person who doesn't know anything about genetics look at a genetic makeup of his own and how his identity has been made out of this understanding of science? Could you please explain?
Sure, I think everyone understands the principles of conditions and features that run in families. We all talk about how our children look like their grandmother or whatever. It was back in the early 20th century that the term genetics was coined by William Bateson to describe studying conditions that run in families, so familial traits. The scientists at the time had only just discovered the rules of Mendel and how genes work and how we transmit our genes, and they realized that conditions that we recognize as diseases in humans could run in families and be inherited from one generation to the next. And so the term genetics was coined to study familial traits. And then in more recent years, a new word came along, genomics. And genomics is kind of looking at the big picture, actually looking at the DNA that our genes are made of and understanding why those conditions happen and how we can identify them by analyzing the DNA.
Yes, but why do we need understanding of genetics? Why do we see something which are not visible to our naked eye, and why do we dwell so much into the cell and body and understanding everything? Why don't we because for this many years, thousands of years, humans were dealing with nature without all this understanding. But what wisdom this knowledge has given to the mankind, and why this knowledge is important? What do you think?
Well, you know that knowledge is important because disease is a major challenge for humans and always has been for thousands of years, and Ayurvedic medicine goes back a long time. And what has happened in those thousands of years is that doctors would observe people who were ill and try to understand how it was happening and what they could do to prevent it or change it. What's happened in the recent years, especially in terms of conditions that run in families, is that we can now go to the next level. Instead of simply observing and making a diagnosis from the appearance, we can now understand the underlying cause. And that is very important in picking out the people who are at the most high risk, especially of late onset diseases. So when I began as a specialist in genetics, I was mainly interested in conditions in children, when children were born with deafness or blindness, and understanding why that happened. But in more recent years, I focus more on conditions that develop as we get older. So we appear fine, and then a problem like cancer will happen maybe when we're only 30 or 40 years old, and that's unusual. And so we now understand much more about why a spelling mistake, a simple spelling mistake in one gene, can actually cause someone to have a very high risk of cancer. And if we can find that out in time, we can give them extra checks to make sure that we detect it early or even prevent it completely. And so that's, I think people understand the value of that because we don't wait for it to happen, we predict it because we understand the genetic spelling mistake that caused it.
Okay, right. You have worked a lot in the sector of Lynch syndrome and other cancers. So why did this cancer cell attracted you to get into the research area?
So, it was a very late part of my career. As I said, when I was younger, I was most interested in things like spina bifida and heart defects, heart murmurs, and problems in children. But then I was introduced by a friend to some families where the young people were getting cancers very early. And we realized if we could find the gene for that and predict which ones were at risk, we could prevent their cancers. And then that was a condition called familial adenomatous polyposis, very long name. Basically, they would get lots of little precancerous lumps or polyps in their bowel. And then another group of families became obvious to us who had a similar risk of cancer, but they didn't get lots of polyps. And at first it was called hereditary non-polyposis colon cancer, which is a very complicated name. And we helped with colleagues in Boston to find the genes that were causing that problem. And then my colleagues in Baltimore very quickly thereafter also found the same genes. And that then gave us the understanding of this new condition, which was made popular by a doctor called Henry Lynch. And Henry was a gastroenterologist in Omaha, Nebraska. And he spent years telling people that this was running in families. We had families, and we had a family near where I grew up, where 45 people in one extended family had colon cancer, bowel cancer. And we all said this has to be genetic. And in those days people said no, cancer isn't genetic. So then once we found the genes, we found that these genes were called mismatch repair genes, and they're basically a spell checker. Everyone who's written on a computer now knows that their software will spell check. They underline the mistakes. So our body, every cell in our body has a spell checker just the same. In fact, every living thing, every plant, every animal uses the same genes to spell check. So each time a cell divides, the genes inside it are copied into the next cell, and they have to be spell checked to make sure they're the same. If your spell checker breaks, those genes start to make mistakes. And when genes start to make mistakes, they lose control of the divisions of the cells, and they start to grow and grow and grow. And that's what we see as cancer, when lots of cells are dividing out of control, not like criminals in society. They're looking after themselves and not thinking of the people around them. And so those cells are now a danger to the whole body. And what we can now predict is who is at risk of that condition and do things to prevent it.
Okay. So, to fight against the emperor of all maladies, how did you choose a simple drug like aspirin?
Okay, so
where does this thought came from?
So this is back to ancient medicine, and in fact aspirin was discovered by the Egyptians, and I haven't found any evidence of it being in Ayurvedic medicine, but I'm sure it is. But basically it was observed for a long time that the willow plant, if you dried the willow bark, you could use it to kill pain. And that was rediscovered in the West and turned into aspirin, which was in 1899 it was sold. And basically this was an ancient remedy that was used to treat inflammation and pain. And so in the 20th century, lots of people took aspirin for headaches, and then they started taking it to prevent heart attacks. And a doctor working in Melbourne called Gabriel Kuhn, who I met many times, he observed in people with bowel cancer, if you compared people with bowel cancer to people who didn't have bowel cancer, the people with bowel cancer were less likely to be taking aspirin. So it seemed like aspirin maybe protected you against cancer. And just at that time, we discovered this new group of families who had this genetic risk of getting cancer. And I was looking for something to try, to say, well, let's try things on them to prevent them getting cancer, because if it works for them, it might work for the rest of us. And since Gabriel Kuhn says that people who take aspirin seem to get less cancer, okay, let's give them some aspirin. So it was an easy idea. It was quite difficult to do. So we ended up having to go to 16 countries and 43 genetic centers to find the 1,000 people we needed who had Lynch syndrome, as we called it then, and give them either 2 aspirin tablets or 2 dummy tablets, 2 placebos. So it's very important in research. It's so easy to make a bias. And so what we couldn't know who was getting the aspirin, who wasn't. They didn't know whether they were getting aspirin or not. But I'd previously been involved in a research trial to prevent spina bifida, and in that we used 2 treatments. So we gave half them the aspirin and half not, and we tried another wild idea, which was high fiber, what's called resistant starch. And that came from a doctor who worked in Africa called Dennis Burkitt, and he said that people who eat lots of fiber in their diet, indigestible food that you can't easily break down, seem to get less cancer. So we gave people that too. So it was called, the technical term is a factorial trial. So you had 4 treatment boxes. You could get aspirin, you could get starch, you could get aspirin and starch, or you get neither. And we followed those people for 20 years. And in 2020, we wrote the paper, and Hersheth, my former student, who now is the head of the institute here, we wrote the paper and we discovered that the people to whom we had given the aspirin had 50% fewer cancers in their colon. So they were half the cancer risk. We didn't prevent all of them, but that was really worth having. So a 50% protection. And even more surprising, the people we gave the high fiber diet to, we didn't prevent their bowel cancers, but we reduced all their other cancers. So the cancers of the stomach and the top end of the gut were much, much less common in people who took a lot of resistant starch, like you get from, say, a green banana. So these were, again, this is both very effective treatments and both very cheap. And so now our task is to get people with Lynch syndrome to eat a high fiber diet and take some aspirin. The big problem is that doctors know that aspirin can give you ulcers and cause bleeding. And so we've done another trial, which finishes this year, which has been running for 10 years, where we give people different doses of aspirin. So some people are on 2 tablets, some are on 1 tablet, some are on a baby aspirin. And we're following those people now through our National Cancer Registry to see whether the people on the small amount of aspirin get the same level of protection as the big dose. And we'll know that in the next few months. And then we hope to make it a regulation for doctors to prescribe people with Lynch syndrome some aspirin to protect them. We already have a recommendation, and we'll take that to the next level. So, I mean, it was a delight that the hunch in 1991 turned out to be right, that the people who have a high genetic risk are the people you should focus on to try out ways of changing lifestyle and taking tablets to prevent cancers, because they have such a high risk that anything that you do, we can measure. Whereas if we did that in the general population, we'd have to study hundreds of thousands of people for a very long time, or certainly tens of thousands. It would take a very long time to know whether it worked. So I came from a village in the north of England where we used to dig coal, so we had lots of miners, and the miners used to take canaries in cages with them into the mine, because if there was gas in the mine, the canary would start having problems and they could all run away. So I used to say that the people with Lynch syndrome are like the canaries in our mine. So they are it's more obvious that what we are doing is having an effect in them, and so they give us a lesson for the rest of the population. So basically a little aspirin and a high fiber diet really reduces cancer risk. The question people ask me is, why did it take 100 years to find that out? And the simple answer is that nothing happens for the first 4 years. So the people we gave the aspirin to, when we did our first analysis, there was no effect because it hadn't had time to work. And so for generations, doctors were giving people aspirin in trials for things like heart attacks, but they would only study them for 3 years and then they would stop. And one of my friends, Peter Rothwell in Oxford, went back to the trials done in the 1980s for heart attacks and said, what happened to the people who got the aspirin? And sure enough, the people who got the aspirin in those trials had less cancers 10 years later. So we have indirect as well as direct evidence that it works. Now you're going to maybe ask, so why does it work? And I take you back to the willow plant. So in fact, all green plants make salicylate to protect themselves against infection. And we think that maybe that we lost aspirin when we started to become farmers and we protect our plants from infection. The plants don't need to make any aspirin to protect themselves. And so the plants that we eat now, because they're made so well, they don't contain salicylate, the chemical of aspirin. And so maybe what we're doing with that little aspirin is putting back something that our diet used to have when, 10,000 years ago, but when we became very efficient farmers, we accidentally lost it.
Best. But I would like to ask that what could be the possible mechanism of action that aspirin might play a role inside the body, because we know it as an anti-inflammatory, antiplatelet. But what kind of role it does really play inside the body, inside the cells? Like does it give command to the center of the cell? Does it give command to any protein making mechanism? What does it do?
Well, I could go back to you for your first question and say, why do we care? If it works, let's take it. But yes, I mean, the thing is, we always want to investigate and understand the reason why. And that's, in answering the question, is there something we could take like aspirin that maybe doesn't cause ulcers? So yes, we need to do that research. The short answer is we're not sure, but we have some ideas. The first idea is, you mentioned inflammation. So we all understand inflammation, pain in our joints, it's a very primitive reaction of the body when it is unwell. If you take an aspirin, it reduces inflammation. And in fact, if you take other drugs for inflammation, that also makes cancer less common. So anti-inflammatory effect might be one thing. The second thing is what I said about plants. So green plants, when they get infected, what they do is they die. So the leaf will wither if it's infected to stop the rest of the plant becoming infected. And it's called programmed cell death. And our body uses programmed cell death to kill cells that are behaving badly. And it may be that in the same way as in the plant, the salicylate, the aspirin, is inducing programmed cell death in cells which are beginning to behave badly before they become cancer. There is a third possibility. I said that we take aspirin to prevent heart attacks because it makes the blood less likely to clot. The reason for that is that there are tiny cells in our blood called platelets, and when clots form, they stick together. And aspirin stops them sticking together. And I have friends I work with in Rome who have shown that is the chemical effect on the platelet. It actually, if the platelets are blocked, that reduces inflammation. So it may be that the inflammation or the problems in the bowel and elsewhere are connected, or the aspirin effect is connected to that antiplatelet effect as a sort of second-hand influence. If that's true, that's great, because we have other drugs that we can use for platelet stickiness that don't cause ulcers. So we're just waiting to hear about a new grant, which, if my wife allows me to carry on working, we'll do another 5 years, and we will see if we can find out the answer to your question. But if we can't, we're back to observational medicine. It's simple, it's cheap, it's available, and it works. And as long as you don't get ulcers with it, the one thing I would say is that when we get old, like me, we seem to be less tolerant of aspirin. So most of the problems happen in people over 65, over 70. So we generally say take aspirin younger. Okay. And in fact, in our trial, there was no real difference in side effects between the people who got the aspirin and the ones who didn't.
So if you want to prevent cancer in your 50s, you have to start taking aspirin in your 30s.
Exactly. Yeah. And start early and get ahead of the game.
Okay. One of the questions that I would like to ask is that you might have begun your medical practice or research and understanding many decades ago. Your understanding of body and how it works would be very much different at that age. And at this age, at this point of time, what kind of understanding of body and what kind of wisdom that you have achieved throughout your entire journey of medicine and practice and research and conversations and dialogues and everything, because you have been to all over the world. So now what's your understanding of the body?
So I obviously trained as a doctor, and so my first thing was to dissect a person and look at their muscles like doctors have always done. And the more I become involved in genetics, the more I've understood the importance of those underlying mechanisms. But the other thing I've discovered increasingly as a geneticist is that so many of the diseases we worry about are actually caused by the way we live and not by our genes. And that's partly because our genes were influenced by our experiences thousands of years ago. That's how we came to be as we are. We have teeth to cut meat with the front and grind vegetables at the back, and these are sort of acquired traits from generations ago. Our lifestyle now is not the lifestyle that we were designed for. We don't run around all the time. We sit still. We eat too much food, we eat too much meat. These are all things that we know that we were not designed to do. And so what we need to think about is, what was our body designed for? It was designed to move, it was designed to eat meat, sure, but you have to catch it first. So, we would eat meat rarely, don't eat meat too much. And so interestingly, as a geneticist, I've become more and more interested in the environment, because many of the diseases that afflict mankind now are the diseases we caused ourselves, being overweight, having artery problems and so on. These are so much to do with our lifestyle and so much under our own control. We can't change our genes, but we can change the world that they live in.
Okay, you've been into genetic testing and everything. You are kind of work you are doing. What do you think? What would be the implications in the larger country like India with this kind of knowledge? Will it really empower governments? Will it really empower systems to fight against it? Or will it increase the natural disobedience of natural laws? Because now we are empowered with the certain knowledge that we can really deal at very micro level, and we don't need to follow the natural laws. So what's your understanding or what's your thoughts about it?
I think that's a really interesting question. In fact, I'm involved with the Human Genome Organization. I'm its vice president. And one of our primary interests is, how do we take this knowledge to the whole world? And how do we work with colleagues around the world to make it valuable to all people and not just to rich people in Western countries? And I think that there are some challenges here. First of all, the tests that we do are expensive. So one of my research interests, I work with, we helped to set up a little company making simple little machines that will do DNA testing where you are, rather than having to send the samples far away. And that can make it cheaper and possible, for example, to find out if you will get a bad reaction to a drug, or to find out if you have an infection, because infectious agents have genes too. And so we can diagnose COVID or diagnose TB or diagnose malaria by looking at the genes of those organisms in your blood or in your saliva. So there are some of this knowledge can be taken into the front line. However rich or poor someone is, it can make a difference. And we're working in South Africa and now in the Congo with a new TB test, which looks for not for our genes, but for the genes of the tuberculosis in the blood. And that tells you whether you have TB. So I think this knowledge applies to everyone. And of course, the other thing it applies to is developing new drugs. What we did with aspirin is now becoming the norm. We can study people with specific problems and develop drugs for them, which can be relevant to the wider population. The big concern is, what you, I think, hinted at, is this is expensive medicine, so the rich people have it and the poor people don't, and you increase the difference between the rich and the poor. And I think that can be avoided, but it needs central thought, central planning. We need to be careful not to. I think the biggest concern is that if you have lots of DNA tests, first of all, it's easy to sell people DNA tests and charge them a lot of money. You don't know whether you even got the test, so it can be done badly, and so you need regulation of that. But we also need to be thoughtful about the risk of telling you that you're at high risk of bowel cancer, so you start having lots of examinations of your bowel. Instead of giving those same tests to someone who needs them, you're getting tests you don't really need, and you're using up health resources. So trying to keep our focus on the population's need. And I think that's something that India works hard to achieve. It's very difficult in such a big country with such diversity to achieve what we can do on our small island. But it must be what we try to do, to try and take healthcare to everyone, because that ultimately is good for the whole country.
Correct. And my last question is that we are a cognitive superpower on this planet. Will this understanding will this understanding or will the technology like CRISPR and everything, AI and everything, will make us a genetic superpower as well? Or what are the challenges that lies ahead in this century?
Yeah, so I think India already is a superpower in so many areas, and you have a fantastically well-educated population and so many young scientists like Hirsch who came to work with me, and so you have great potential. You also have great diversity. So one of the things we've become increasingly aware of, and I'll be speaking about today, is that many of our databases are based on North Europeans who are a fairly small community, whereas India has 1 billion people with much more ancient diversity. So research here can inform the whole world. And I think what I'm hoping is that we can use this knowledge for good. First of all, to reduce the burden of late onset disease and tell people that are at more risk and maybe change their lifestyle, but also help to protect families from the diseases of childhood, because we know that if a family is certain their children will grow into adulthood, they will have fewer children. And the planet needs fewer people. You know, we're making too many babies in many countries. So I think security of knowledge that the children will be healthy will hopefully reduce that burden too.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sir John Byrne, for joining us and having this conversation. So this was Sir John Byrne talking about genetics, talking about CRISPR and what challenges that lies ahead and what kind of potential role it can play for Indian population and worldwide as well. So thank you for joining this conversation. Thank you so much.